Today, we'll be hearing from Dr. Darin Latimore. He is Yale School of Medicine's first Deputy Dean of Diversity and Inclusion and its first Chief Diversity Officer. He is devoted to increasing diversity within medical and academic spaces and to improving the climate of YSM's learning and working environments. He is responsible for and implementing YSM's comprehensive diversity strategic plan, which includes a focus on recruitment and retention of faculty and students from backgrounds that have been historically underrepresented in science and medicine, while creating an inclusive environment for all of YSM's community. In his role, he has implemented a comprehensive program to improve faculty diversity and retention that focuses on policies, programs, and building community. He also oversees programs that support the outreach, recruitment, success, and retention of YSM students and postdoctoral fellows. He is co-chair of YSM students and co-chair of YSM's program for art in public spaces, which has commissioned new works of art featuring diverse leaders and has hosted public exhibits that feature artwork by and about members of YSM's community. Dr. Latimore joined Yale in 2017 from the University of California, Davis, where he was Associate Dean for Student and Resident Diversity. After attaining his medical degree at the University of California, Davis, and completing his residency there as well in internal medicine. Everyone, welcome Dr. Latimore.
Well, I apologize in advance for those of you guys who are on Zoom. Darin Latimore does not stand behind a podium. So you'll quickly realize how much I move around. So I give my apologies if I am or am not in your actual screenshot. So today we're going to talk about implicit bias. If you ever actually want me to come back and talk about the strategic plan itself and what we've actually accomplished, which actually is significant, I'll be glad to do that on a different day. My goals for our conversation, he told you kind of the boring stuff about me, but who Darin Latimore truly is this person on the screen at the moment. And that's my daughter. And that was many moons ago when I actually had a waistline. So today we're going to talk about implicit bias, at least how I'm using that, because I think you're about to go into the residency sort of process. I'm actually going to focus initially on talking about language in student evaluations, be it gendered, be it racialized, and then go to the MSPE, again, gendered, racialized language in there, just so you'll hopefully go into the process thinking about it a little differently. Then I'll pivot to looking at CVs, language and letters of recommendations, and depending on how my timing is, I'll talk a little bit about R01s and actually that process being racialized and gendered. Again, may or may not have time to do that, and then end with looking at how we can mitigate our bias as individuals, and then I'll also have a little bit of structural. And very lastly, we'll be looking at a study that actually supports that actually doing these sort of interventions actually does change outcomes. Again, I'm not sure we're going to do all of that in our allotted time, but that is the goal. So I want to be very clear, when I'm talking about implicit bias, I am not using it in a pejorative way. Every single one of us has bias. Our brains are actually wired that way. So that within itself is not what's problematic. What's problematic is our biases are actually seated in the stereotypes of our culture. Most of our biases actually benefit the predominant groups in the culture, be it the religious group, be it the economic group, be it the racial group, be it the gender group, and they disadvantage the minoritized, marginalized, and stigmatized within that same culture. That is what the problem is. The fact that we have bias is not the problem, because everyone, including Darin Latimore, has bias. I'm talking specifically about unconscious bias. I'm not talking about our bias that we wear on our shoulders and we're very conscientious about, but I'm hoping to get us to realize how much of what we think we are actually working from fact, we're actually working from bias. And that's the conversation I'm trying to have today. Those of us who really want to be egalitarian and really want to treat all peoples equally, which is the goal we should all have in our lives, are probably the ones who have the hardest time looking in the mirror. Because if we truly looked in the mirror, we would actually see a very different person than who we aspire to be. So I think everyone realizes that they have bias. What I do not think people are actually doing is actually making the leap from their bias to what actions it allows them to do. So the language that's very common today is microaggressions. Microaggressions are the actions of your bias. It's flat out discriminating against people, which means you're actually doing things that have a measurable harm to another human being, are the actions of your bias. Silent collusion. I want to spend a second here because a lot of the time we think I did nothing. I did not add, I did not subtract in any way, shape, or form. I don't know if it's your culture to actually sit on the wall, but if you would like, everyone, please come onto the table. I actually would love to have a conversation. Thank you very much. So silent collusion is this concept that, and again, there's many reasons to be silent, many, many reasons, including self-preservation in a culture of retribution and retaliation. But the other reason we are often silent is because we do not actually believe, consciously or subconsciously, the group that needs our advocacy is actually worth it. And that's when bias comes in. What bias, what stereotypes have actually allowed American society to attack 80-year-old women just because they happen to be Asian? How deep-seated is that it is okay to attack elderly people just because of what we think their race is? I ask you to think about these children that we seem to be okay with putting in cages. And I ask you to think about the biases of people who are south of our border. And then I ask you to think about children who are from Canada, white Canada. We're very clear, white Canadians. Could you ever envision in your brain putting their children in a cage? I don't care why they might have migrated or come down to America. Could you ever imagine putting their children in cages? So I ask you what biases and stereotypes differentiate how we think about our northern border and our southern border that made this okay. Then I ask you to think about the 403 years that people who look like me have been in this country and all the stereotypes literally from day one that got us to the point that someone thought it was okay to put their knee on another human being's neck until the point that they could not breathe. So again, the stereotypes and biases are not the big issue in my opinion. The actions that they allow us to do and the inaction that they allow the other officers to not do is the problem. Bias affects our perceptions of other people, our attitude around people. How do you behave when you walk into a room of all others? Whom in this space do you make sure to give your attention to? Who at your meetings do you make sure to listen to? And who in our society do you actually give empathy to, and who do we not so much? I do a lot of climate and culture surveys, a lot of them, for different departments who ask for it. And one of the major spaces that actually microaggressions actually occur are in meetings. If you've never actually just sat back and watched who actually is being given airtime, who not, whose ideas are being respected and whose are being just negated, and whose ideas are being stolen by another individual and amplified and giving credit to the second individual, not the first one. If you've never done that, I would encourage you to do that one day in your space. The Harvard Implicit Association test, again, I'm not gonna say it's a perfect by any means, there are multiple problems with it, but it by far is the tool used most, especially in science, to actually look at bias. So if you've never gone onto the site, I would encourage that you do. Each test maybe takes 10, 15 minutes. Again, the test is not perfect, absolutely. But I would encourage you to actually utilize the tools because the studies, and it's been used all around the world, have definitely shown that your actions map to the results of your implicit bias test way more than they map to your belief about what biases you have or don't have. Let's pivot to the science. So again, I want to start with student evaluations. So this study was done at 2 institutions, and what it did looked at all third-year clerkships, and it broke up into the historically underrepresented in medicine and science and those who are not. This is problematic on the Asian side because there's clearly some biases there, but just in all honesty, they lumped Asians and Caucasians, and they lumped historically underrepresented. And what they were looking at was the narratives and the language. And they were trying to see what was racialized and what was gendered. So if there were words that were used across all evaluations like student, then that's not going to pull out. But if there were words that were specifically seen to be only used and they did binary gender, I want to be very honest, only on a female woman or man's evaluation, then that would get pulled out. If it was only on non-URM's evaluations or URM's evaluations, that would get pulled out. They looked at if the language was really looking at competencies, which is theoretically what third-year evaluations are supposed to be evaluating competency, not personality, and how much was actually evaluating personality. This is the words that they came up with. So again, even though we're supposed to be evaluating competencies, that's what you're supposed to be getting on your MSPEs. You can see what quite often people are evaluating is personality, i.e. do they like the person or not? Let's look at the words. So the first thing I want to make very clear, non-URMs are purple, URMs are green. Something should jump out at you immediately. We have way more expansive ways of looking at non-URMs than we do URMs. The second thing that should jump out at you immediately, so those outstanding words that you're looking for in the evaluations, they're all in the non-URM side. Exceptional, outstanding, excellent, superior over here. When words that are specifically associated with non-URMs, and I don't know, have a clue why this is an evaluation, native, soft, Spanish. The second thing I would like you to look at is the words and how they related to the grade that the person got. So neutral means the word, the x-axis means the word is not actually associated with getting honors or pass. The higher the associated dot that you see to the word, the more likely it was associated with getting an honors. The lower the word dot associated with the word, the more likely it was associated with the pass. You may or may not notice something that I'm going to point out to you, but let's start on the non-URM side. Every single word at worst is neutral and does not associate with a grade, or better associates with honors at some level or another. Every single word for URMs at best is neutral or is associated with a lower grade. Every single word. When we look at gender, again, our language is very gendered, but the association grade-wise is not really there, but we do use very different language. This second study, this is a one institution study, and it was only surgery. And what they were trying to figure out is if a person uses gendered pronouns, how does that change the language around it? So this is only about gender in this specific study. And the researchers were blind to the person's gender until after the study. So again, sort of using the language that was used in the original study. So ability is actually what you should be evaluating the students. Grindstone comes out of the original studies looking at gender letters of recommendation, much more likely to use those outstanding terms for men, much more likely to use grindstone language for women. But that's the historical. So, but that's how they broke it up based on historical. Again, and then personality. Much more likely to use personality terms for women. What did they find? They found a lot of different words were used. In this particular case, personality is a little bit less than ability, which again is what we should be evaluating, but it's not far off. So female evaluations contained more gender pronouns. So she, her was before the language in front or back much more often in evaluations for women versus probably for men. They actually probably use a person's name. This was driven more by the male evaluations. Now I want to be honest with you because women write longer evaluations in general. The likelihood of them using more pronouns, both male or female pronouns, is common, but because their evaluations are longer in general, period. Now, so if we use a male pronouns, then the language, for a male evaluator, if they use a female pronoun, then they most likely are going to use grindstone language around it, which is not what you want to hear or see. If they were to use male pronouns, they were much more likely to use outstanding language around it. Again, this is all subconscious. I don't think anybody is purposefully doing this, but I would encourage you when you're actually looking at the evaluations of your applicants to be thinking about it. And the MSPE, all of what I just showed you feeds into this. And this was also done here as by Ross and Boatwright, and they looked at, when you look at the MSPE, again, looking at the language, what words do we use? I'm only pulling out those that are significant at 0.001. You will see the standout words. There's only one ethnic group. And if you look at the word that nobody really wants on their MSPE, competent, there's one very specific ethnic group. If we look at it from a gender perspective, this might suggest that we've actually moved forward in a positive way because all the words that I have highlighted that are at 0.001 are for women. But in my opinion, many of them, again, are the stereotypical language that are things that we think about for women. The one caring, kind, empathetic. If you really are honest with ourselves about historically what a woman's role in our society was and a man's role in our society, those words would map to what we historically would think a woman's role is. Taking care of the kids, being compassionate, being the person that brings everybody together, et cetera, et cetera. Not the leadership, exceptional, outstanding. I'm going to pivot to looking at CVs and letters of recommendations, more for a job. So this is one of many studies. I'm surprised that we professors have not figured out yet that we're being studied when we're being asked to do this. So the historical ones were done at Ivy League schools, including this one, looking at CVs and looking at gender differences. This one is done at public research intensive institutions, physics and biology of the departments. Person has a PhD, they're looking for a postdoc. The original ones were purely done by gender. This is looking at the intersectionality of gender and race. At that time, when they were developing the study, these were very common names for people of those gender and those races. Again, they only looked at the physics and biology department, and this is a no, it's not one institution. I'm sorry, I apologize. So what they told the faculty was that they were really evaluating the format and the style of the CV and how that impacted their likeliness of moving the person forward. But by the way, do they feel competent? Do they feel hireable? Do they feel likable? And again, this is the historical questions that they're trying to answer. Every time I give this talk, I'm still dumbfounded on how anybody can look at anybody's CV and decide if they're likable. But it maps for every study. It's going to map exactly the way I'm about to show you. It mapped in this one again. Results. If we're looking at gender, these were driven by physics, not biology. Men are significantly more competent. And I want to be very clear, the CVs are the same. The only thing that's different is the name of the individual on top of it. But the quality of the CV, there is no difference. Men are more hireable. Women are more likable. If we look at race ethnicity, whites and Asians are more competent than Blacks and Latinx. Whites and Asians are more hireable than Blacks and Latinx. And likable is not significantly different across the races. So what groups of people do you think actually fared the worst, since we're looking at intersectionality in this study?
Females, one.
Exactly. They were the least hireable, the least competent. This was driven by physics. Again, quality of CVs, exactly the same. Yes.
Was there, you may not know this, but was there a difference in the faculty across those two departments?
Oh, absolutely. Biology has more women faculty. Absolutely. And but let me since we brought that up, I want to be. Women actually rate men above women also, but the culture when you have women in the space is more normalized. This is looking at letter of recommendations for a prestigious postdoctoral fellowship in genoscience. Again, they're really trying to reproduce or relook at the studies that said women's letters of recommendations are shorter. They're less on point, talk more about that personality than the real traits that you would be looking for in someone in the position, and have more doubt raiser. So that's the historical. Again, they're looking at letters from all around the world. The original studies were done stateside only. One thing that they found, so about on the shorter part, is that letters we're very cultural in our letters. Depending on what country the letter writer is in, the average length of letters vary drastically. I've not seen this at this institution, but I will be honest with you, at my previous institution, we literally judged by the length of a letter. A short letter, no matter what it said, conferred something negative to us. And a longer letter, no matter what words were in that letter, conferred something positive to us. What they find, we in America actually write longer letters than the rest of the world. So again, that's cultural. Longer letters do tend to have more of those excellent adjectives. And unfortunately, once again, women are half as likely to get an outstanding letter, no matter where the letter writer is in the world, no matter where the individual originates from in the world. Pivoting to race. So this, I'll be very clear, this is not in science. This study was looking at quote unquote business. So I'll be very honest about that. So all these undergraduates were actually graduating at the same time. They had the same number of honors. They've been on the dean's list the same number of times. And they're supposed to graduate at the same time. And so they wanted to look at, does whitening of your CV actually improve your chances of being called back for a job interview? We have two very different narratives in this country. And I'm generalizing here, we're very clear about that, generalizing. Many in the more dominant part of our society think that minorities, when they apply for jobs, we put minority every place we possibly can in order to get the job. What the majority of society doesn't know is that many of us minorities are actually told by our elders, whitewash your CV as much as possible if you want the job. And how that actually plays out is, for example, if you're Asian, you quite often will change your Asian sounding name, first name, last name doesn't seem to matter, to a very neutral sounding Western European sounding name. Have you ever thought about how many of your colleagues who are literally from Asia are called Luke and Jan? Do we honestly believe they don't know how to pronounce their own name? And if you're like the aspiring Asian American business leader, you'll just say, I was the president of the business association. And I have seen this here. I have literally had people ask me, what does it mean to be the president of the Black Student Union? And I ask them, what does it mean to be the president of the student union? Oh, and they can rattle off a whole bunch of things of what that probably meant. I'm like, well, what do you think the difference is? Why can you not visualize what it means to be the president of the Black Student Union? But it's so easy for you to visualize what it means to be the president of the student union. And I've literally had that conversation here. For African Americans, we tend to either change our name. If our middle name is more neutral, we'll use that, or we'll change our name and just use the letters. And again, the other part is, instead of saying Black African American, blah, 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 just say I was the president of the blah, blah, blah. What was the results? So in this study, if you were your authentic self, an ethnic sounding name, ethnic sounding activities, the least number of callbacks. If you changed your first name to a more neutral sounding name and not an ethnic sounding name, more callbacks. If you change your activities to a more neutral sounding and did not make them ethnocentric, more callbacks. At this point for African Americans, it's now statistically significant. If you change both your name and your activities to sound Western European and not ethnocentric, the most callbacks, and now we're statistically significant for both groups. And it's just a callback so you can actually get the job interview. They haven't actually physically seen you yet. How am I doing on time? Was that, I'm actually doing pretty good, okay. So, yes, please.
So what was the difference between the white and the black columns?
Oh, thank you.
Wasn't that the change?
No. The black and the white columns is the, shoot, which one is which? One of them is
All jobs versus substantial jobs. With
no. Let me answer your question. One of them is that you're not screaming and howling, I'm a equal opportunity employer. And the other one, I can't remember which one is which. Shoot.
That's not the description. Right?
Pro-diversity. No, let's see. Pro-diversity language. That's the difference. One of them is you're saying that you are, you're expounding in that advertisement that you actually are encouraging people from diverse backgrounds to apply. And the other one, that language is not there.
It's a description of the application.
Well, it is a description of your values of the organization in the job announcement. Does that make sense now?
Yeah, it's not a change between the two. That's what I was trying to figure out.
Yeah, but well, that's not statistically significant between the two. So having language expounding that you're actually, quite frankly, down for diversity does not seem to actually lead to actually calling people for an interview.
Change from the left going across to the right. I see that. I misunderstood it.
Any other questions for me before I move forward? So I had a colleague.
Did they look at gender in that, or that was just?
No, that was just race, ethnicity. And what was now, in the group that I did not show, that did not show a difference, which I was fascinated by, is the Hispanic Latinx community did not show a difference. And I don't fully understand that based on mapping for the Asians and Blacks. So I had a colleague ask me or make a statement to me, when are minorities no longer disadvantaged? This was a colleague in academia. Sort of implying that once we actually got into the academy, the playing field was completely level and we need to stop using the race card. That was what was implied, in my opinion, in the conversation. So I actually want to just very quickly actually shed some light on the not so reality of that. So one of the most important things from an advancement perspective at Yale is how many NIH grants you have. At Yale School of Medicine, how many publications you have. We're just going to look at the NIH data. And they've actually looked at this themselves. So this is their spotlight. And what you will find is on this study, which they repeated, Dr. Valentine, who was the diversity person for the NIH, actually re-looked at this recently. I apologize, I put the wrong slide in here. She's now at Stanford, but she looked at it again and found very similar results and with one caveat. So they controlled for things that they could control for, and what they still found is if you were Asian or if you were African-American, even if you have the same credentials as the white male person who's applying for an R01, you are less likely to be funded. I'm not showing you the gender slide, but there's also similar data from a gender perspective. A female person, irrespective of race, ethnicity, with the same credentials are less likely to be funded. What has changed when they did the original, it was both the R1s and the Ks. Ks, that gap has actually started to close. It is not as significant as much. R1s, the gap is still statistically significant. So this is looking at people who have, this is a one-site institution who already have R1, so we would assume that they have some scientific prowess, and they're applying for renewal of their R01. This is gender, not race, ethnicity. And they want to look at the language within the R1s. Does it, or the evaluation of the R1s, is it similar to letters of recommendation, which multiple studies have now shown gender language in letters of recommendation? Do we have gender language in the people who are actually evaluating the grants that we turn in? Again, one site, but it made it easy for them to get all of the language. What did they find? And for those of you guys who are steeped in science, you know the lower score is the better score. So let's look at the two genders here. What jumps out or should jump out? We'll look at the difference in all the scores. Do you see something jump out at you about the difference in all the scores? Every single one, every single category? I'm sorry? Can you say it a little bit louder?
Females are worse.
The men have better scores in every single domain. Some of them are trends. The ones that I started for you are statistically significant, but is that scientifically possible? Every single domain. And if you look at the language that at least in this study, and again, it's a one-site institution, but it's not the institution that's actually doing the evaluation. So we're very clear. If we're talking about qualifications, if we talk about men, we're using that outstanding language we're looking for, a pioneer, a leader in the field. If we're talking about women, then we're using language more like expertise, which on its surface may sound like a nice term, but you know what? Your technician has expertise. You really, that is not a standout language that you actually truly are looking for. If you look for quality, if it's men, we are much more likely to amplify highly significant, highly innovative, versus a woman, we're not likely to do that. When we do weaknesses, which I thought this was fascinating, for men, we're much more likely to create a nice, soft sandwich. Say something nice, squeeze in the weakness, say something nice. Women, we're much more likely just to give whatever we consider to be criticism. And where women stand out, again, does not surprise me. When you talk about environment, that is where we're much more likely to talk about women in a more positive way than men in creating a welcoming environment in the lab space. So unfortunately, the narrative in America still is that is women and men who actually are the ones who, because of quote unquote affirmative action, have the opportunities, who are given the upper hand. The science actually in no way supports that narrative. And unfortunately, it's a very damning narrative, quite frankly, in this nation, from a point of view of creating equity in this country. How can we actually, as individuals and as a team, try and mitigate this? So the first thing is we have to recognize and accept that we all have biases and not approach it from a negative perspective, because there's no way on earth we're ever going to be able to actually examine or try and diminish our biases if we're not willing to actually look in the mirror. From a process perspective, I would strongly advocate that you think about ways to remind each other about potential bias prior to doing evaluations across people of different identities. And as you can see, there are multiple actual different pinpoints where it could have an impact. Yes.
This is kind of in line. This is a question from Dr. Moore. She wants to know if there's any advice on the writing process. Basically, should we have colleagues edit and scrub the letters that we're writing for the bias in language?
So there are now actually, don't ask me to cite them, but there are actually tools now out there that you can actually shoot your letter through and see if it has gender or racialized language. So there actually are processes to help you either look at your own or to look at letters coming in. I'll be honest with you, it's been many moons since I've done it, but when I did it, I was mortified. I actually did, and mine were mainly for letters for learners. I printed them out because again, the original data said men are longer letters, women are shorter letters. That was a true statement for Darin Latimore. And the other thing that was a true statement, if it was a male, I was much more likely to say their names and say their titles. And if it was a female person, I was way more likely just to use their first name. Did that already. Self-reflection. Again, first step is to realize that we have bias, but really the true work that needs to be done is what actions or inactions are our biases actually allowing us to do. What is the actual impact on others of our bias? And we have to remember, for some, the impact is actually positive. For others, it's harmful. Counter-confirmational bias, again, if you actually do get insight and realize that you do have bias, then, and you know that you're about to be in the presence of a person that you have bias against that group, to really try and visualize and think about someone you hold in high esteem with those same identities. There actually is studies to show that you will have a better interaction with that individual, and that individual will have a better interaction with you in healthcare spaces. It's problematic because in my opinion, you're actually just creating more bias, but at least it's a positive bias, not a negative bias. And the two main biases in our society are confirmational bias and familial bias. So this is a major one. And familial bias will be the institutions that you hold in high esteem, the labs around the world that you hold in high esteem, and therefore making assumptions that an individual who comes out of that space should be held in high esteem, versus institutions you know nothing about or labs you know nothing about, not actually conferring that same positivity, even if the actual outcomes of those two individuals are exactly the same. That'll be familial bias. This is a study that was done here at Yale. Basically, it was just showing that we actually look for the biases that we have. This was preschool children. Preschool teachers were told that they were to look for deviant behavior. There was no deviant behavior. We're talking preschool children. Happen to be 2 Black children, happen to be 2 white children, happen to be 2 boys, happen to be 2 girls. Oh, by the way, let's put some goggles on you while you're looking. Push a button if you see any deviant behavior. Again, there's no deviant behavior. So statistically speaking, they should have looked at all 4 children equally. Again, deviant behavior, think about our stereotypes from a gender perspective. Who do you think they actually were looking at? Deviant behavior, thinking about it in our society from a racial perspective, who do you think they actually were looking at? Again, no deviant behavior, so we should be looking at all 4 children equally. Individualize. We are much better at individualizing people who are the dominant in a group. So if your group has more men than women, we look at the men as individuals. We don't say, oh, all men or all, or if that individual has a positive or a negative trait. If you have a certain ethnic groups or much fewer, much more likely to look at them in your mind as the stereotypes of that group instead of the attributes that they have as an individual. So just reminding yourself to, especially for those minoritized, marginalized, and stigmatized in your space, to remind yourself to look at them as the qualities that they bring to the table and not the stereotypes of their identities. And again, those stereotypes can be positive or negative stereotypes, but it does not help that individual sometimes we do that. Perspective taking. So even though I want you to look at everybody as an individual, I also would like you to do perspective taking. So if you have 2 CVs on your table, both have actually been able to produce the same amount of whatever you're looking for. One comes from the Yales and Harvards of the world. One comes from a much more lower resource institution. Just try and imagine what the low resource institution person may be able to accomplish if they were actually allowed into Yale. And really, truly, the best way to get past our biases is to actually really, truly get to know whoever we consider to be the other, be it a political group in America, be it a religious group, be it different regions of the country, be it race, ethnicity, be it gender. So just very quickly, just want to show you one study that shows that this works. I want to be very honest with you. Darin Latimore is cherry picking at the moment because I can show you a study that says it's all hogwash, or I can show you a study that says it's neutral. So I am very much cherry picking right this moment. So this is Dr. Darin. She basically did an intervention very similar to what we just did, 45 minutes for the intervention group. Stereotype replacement, counter stereotype, individualizing, perspective taking, actually engaging with the individuals. Should sound familiar from our last 40 minutes together. So one group actually had something similar to what we just did, and the other group not so much so. Ask people what their explicit biases are, have them take the Harvard Implicit Association test, and this was race only, very clear. And then kind of did it a couple more times, explicit with implicit, and mapped out the results. And what they found was for the controls who actually, again, did not have the 45-minute session, their implicit association results really did not improve, versus those who did have the 45-minute intervention, you actually do see a improvement in their preference of white people over Blacks on the implicit association test. Clearly at 4 weeks, you have a separation. They say at 8 weeks, you have a separation. In my opinion, those bars touch each other. So I'll say there's a trend still at 8 weeks. Is in your psyche thinking about, am I treating people fairly versus discrimination? Again, those who did not have the intervention have no reason to even be thinking about it, and they weren't. Those who actually did have the intervention, it actually looks like that continues to tick up over time. Now, what they didn't test, which is not easy to test, is did it actually change behavior, which is actually what we really need to know. And on that note, I'm going to stop blah-blahing at you, and you get a chance to tell me I'm full of that, or ask me a question. Thank you.
Thinking about, the fact, a lot of times these biases are unconscious or like subconscious. Is there any value in, like, or do any of the departments look at individual interviewers during the interview season and how they rate people and feed that information back to them, like confidentially? I mean, sometimes
I don't know about departments, but I know our admissions office does now and looks for outliers and by identities. I don't know about departments. Some departments have tried this so hard, especially at the faculty level, to de-identify. It is really hard and time consuming. But some have tried to do that. Yes, I'm sorry, did I finish answer?
Yeah, that, and also I think like for individual interviewers, like, you're interviewing like men and women and different races and ethnicities. Granted, the numbers are probably, they're relatively small for each interviewer, right? It's not like hundreds, it's like 30 to 50. But I mean, if you could get that information fed back to you to see if, just like you said, it's like impossible for all the men to have higher scores than women in R1. Same thing when you're interviewing people. It's impossible that every single male is better than every single female. So if you're ranking people like that, not on purpose, again.
I'm sorry, yes, the department has done it, since you just said, I'm gonna ask these. Yes, the department has done it.
Give it back to them.
So we did an assessment in our department in formally / informally of the gender identity of the faculty and the applicant, and then looked at one individual year and then compared that to kind of historical data that we have to make sure that there was not faculty member who was demonstrated and it did not find consistent relationship between the gender of a particular faculty member and we were not able to easily do that throughout the URM.
No, because you don't know when you're in it, like you think you're doing.
Yeah, so again, it really truly is subconscious. The other thing that I would say, if you do this, don't make the assumption if there's concordance, be it gender or race, ethnicity, that that person was unbiased. Do not make that assumption. There is some data that says certain groups have less bias against the minoritized, marginalized, senior sites in space, but we all still have bias. We all grew up with the same stereotypes in America from literally day one.
Yes. The rationale, the reason it's done, is if the way our numbers that we were using in our department for grading an applicant, if one person grades people very, very, very low, you can actually have outsized impact on the final ranking. And the goal is to make sure that any one individual doesn't have an outsized impact on the department.
Any other questions or comments for me? Yes.
Like what you said earlier about the biology department and having more women in it, and that the women still maintain some of the ranking. I don't want to misrepresent what you said, but my understanding was that the women were still ranking men higher than women, but it was to a lesser degree within that department. Is that a fair?
That discipline. But even the men in that discipline were not, would the gap between how they would rank a man and a woman's name was smaller too. It was, so at least what the thought was, when you actually start having critical mass of what was historically minoritized people in your space, then that becomes more, they become more normalized.
So my question was, I guess that you've already answered, was bringing the women into the group, does that reflect that there's already a culture and therefore the numbers are better? Or bringing the women in changed bringing DEI, let's just say women into a group will change the culture?
Woo, that's a swoop.
Right, because the fact that they were there may be a statement, right?
Yes.
Yes, so because your question is complicated way more than who you hire or don't hire. So what I will say that to truly change culture, not only do you bring people in, i.e. diversity, but you must have an inclusive environment where their voices are actually truly respected. So you need both to truly change culture, which is different than just hiring somebody into your space. Because we hire people into our spaces all the time. The environment is not hospitable at all, and you see revolving doors, which actually one of the institutions actually saw. It's full of men.
Dr. Singh is online and has a question.
Dr. Latimore, can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
So I appreciate you giving us this lecture and training. And I also appreciate as you were doing the slides and showing how the training decreased implicit bias that you disclosed, that there are studies that show it the other way. And I was interested in hearing your comments about the fact that in Journal Club, we talk about publication bias. And generally, people who are doing certain studies have an interest in that field, and they generally publish favorable results. So could it potentially be disheartening that if there are studies the other way, even accounting for another kind of bias, publication bias, that the effect might be not as large as we hope it would be?
Oh, it's extremely complicated, and it actually clearly has negative effects in certain situations. So the problem, in my opinion, is that we're studying groups of people as if they're walking into the room in the same place around DEI issues and are thinking about it the same way. And we're giving one intervention. And some people in the room may be already the course, don't really need a training. And some people in the room are clearly gonna be much more skeptical, but we're evaluating the exact same way. Also, a lot of our trainings, unfortunately, historically have pointed individuals and said, you are wrong, you are bad, you need to change. That is not the way you change hearts and minds. Instead of trying to call people into a conversation. I hope I was a little closer to the calling into a conversation than sitting here pointing at individuals and saying you are the problem. So historically, the way we've done the training in some cases, not so good. And it is way more complicated because the knowledge walking into the room is drastically different amongst people, but we give one training instead of tailoring the training to the actual individual, which would be really hard for me to tailor my training to each one of you in any kind of time that's reasonable. So I just think the whole thing is problematic, quite frankly. But clearly, if you don't do this right, you can offend, upset individuals so they leave with a more negative view than when they walked in, clearly. Hold on, did I cover your question?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it relates to something you and I discussed maybe 2 years ago when you gave this lecture, that it seems like it's such a tall task that we all have in changing behaviors when people are at this level of life and adults and this much training. And I was talking a couple of years ago about how it seems like the intervention's got to be when they're really young kids. That's where real changes could be made, it seems to me.
Oh, it's really young. There's studies that show at 18 months old, you're already starting to track. Literally, so it has to be really young interventions. I think actually society needs the interventions to be on society. Yes.
This isn't a question, it's more of a comment. I think it would be great if there were kind of structural changes that helps reduce the impact of bias. You know, if we had talked at one point about being able to blind our application review and to name, gender, photograph, things like that, and ERAS, it just does not facilitate that at all. It'd be fantastic to be able to do that, but we can't. Is there any suggestions on how just a very practical way that the department can try to minimize bias, at least in application review?
Well, it's not practical because it's exactly what you just said. You have to blind it before someone actually sees it. So that is putting resources, i.e. somebody or bodies who actually can do that for you. Also, the other thing that's been shown on the faculty level that we're doing here that's led to more diverse pools is, and I'm not sure what part it will be, so I'm just going to say on the faculty level, is actually having people look purely at the scientific statement first. Because really, honestly, a lot of our bias here really truly is institution touched or people touched. And if they don't get past whatever, you never even look at the CV, which is the part that's extremely hard to de-identify. The scientific statement could be identified easily. So again, I don't know if the personal statement has enough gravitas in your world that would be something that you could look at first, or if there's another very specific part of the application that tracks to what you're honestly truly looking for that you can look at first before somebody actually looks at the whole application. But that has been shown at the faculty level to actually change outcomes.
Comment on the concept of fit, right? So we had talked about trying to make objective criteria for resident applications, and something that kind of comes up in conversations around, would this person be a good fit? And to me, that seems like that's an area that's very high risk for just saying, does this person fit into the mold of the people who are currently already in positions, and obviously super biased.
So in majority of the time, that's exactly what it means, which is why I gasped when you asked me the question. So if you are going to use that terminology, then you need to define it based on the mission and vision of your institution, your department, or very specific criteria that you guys have for the individual. So fit needs to map to something other than my gut, this person will be a good colleague or not. Because quite frankly, again, familial bias is the second, if not first, strongest bias we all have.
Dr. Latimore, this is Jamie Cavallo. Thank you very much.
Hi, hello.
Hello. Thank you very much for the excellent talk. I wanted to mention, you brought up about having a person fill out a mission statement that is de-identified. And actually, we did discuss this with Dr. Kim, and he was very amenable to implementing that with the new faculty recruits. So we've been working with the business office to ask each faculty applicant to complete a mission statement about what they hope to achieve in their 1, 3, and 5-year timeline should they be hired in this position. And then that mission statement, which is de-identified, is supposed to go to the pool of faculty who are interviewing the individual. And if they feel that that mission statement is congruent with what the department, where the department wants to go in the next 1, 3, 5 years, then the rest of their application would be, they would be invited for interview, and then the rest of their application would be available to them. It makes it a little bit difficult that the institution requires Interfolio to be used because there's no way in Interfolio to de-identify any of the components of the application that the applicant has to fill out there. And would require, redacting, which is very labor intensive, by someone in the department.
I agree with you wholeheartedly, but I salute you. I salute you for doing this. You may be the first urology department in the country to do this. So if you can figure out a way to study it, I would also salute you for that.
In your trainings on implicit bias, do you take time to explain to people that removing the bias instead of coming from it that you're hurting somebody by removing the bias, everybody's helped? So they've done studies that show that instead of the us versus them, if you're expanding what is in the us, that everybody is health, everybody's benefited by that.
So I would agree with you if you can convince people that's true. Which, I mean, it is true, but if you can convince people that's true, unfortunately, and I'm using privilege very broadly here. When a person has privilege in a space, for whatever the reason, even trying to get to equity feels like oppression. So it is very hard to convince people who are truly privileged in a space, and again, I'm using this very broadly, that all boats live together. It is very hard to do. Thank you. Thank you all so much for the conversation.